I drove 9 hours with a box of family heirlooms, only to be told the engagement dinner was yesterday. I stood there holding that box while they smiled like I was just a neighbor who showed up uninvited. That night, I opened the map inside and realized maybe it was never meant to stay in the family. So I left. But what I did next changed everything they thought they owned. The sky was barely light when I turned the key in the ignition. 9 hours of highway stretched ahead, and my back already ached at the thought. But I felt steady and full of purpose. In the passenger seat, nestled in a wool blanket, was a wooden box. Inside that box were 3 hand-drawn maps, each more than 70 years old. My grandfather had traced them by candlelight, one for each major route our family had used back when we ran the small freight lines out of southern Missouri. He passed them to my father, who passed them to me. I had guarded them like breath. Today, I was going to give them to my son. Miles always loved stories, loved hearing about our people, and how they found paths no one else could. When he was little, he'd sit on my lap and trace those same maps with his small fingers, asking me to tell him again where the river split, where the cotton used to grow, where his great-grandfather once camped. It had been a while since he asked for those stories. Still, today felt like the right day. His engagement dinner, a milestone, a beginning, a time to pass on what matters. I hadn't seen Miles in nearly 4 months. Our last call was brief, but his voice sounded rushed. He mentioned they were planning something small, just family. I hadn't pressed. I trusted him. I trusted my son. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun had slipped behind a wide bank of clouds. The house looked newer than I remembered, larger, colder. Renee, his fiancée, opened the door. Her expression faltered yet before she stepped aside. There was no hug, no welcome. I held up the box. I said I brought something for the engagement dinner. She paused, then tilted her head. She said, "Oh, they had the dinner yesterday." I stood there for a second, box in hand. I asked what she meant. She shrugged, said it was last minute. Her family was in town. They figured it made sense. Then she smiled, thin like paper, and said they didn't think I would be up for the travel anyway. Inside, I could hear laughter. Someone clinked a glass. She never moved from the doorway. I felt the box get heavier in my arms. Not from weight, but from shame. A shame that didn't belong to me, but had somehow made itself comfortable on my shoulders. I asked if I could come in for just a moment. She looked back. Then she said, maybe another time. They were still cleaning up. Too much going on. And then the door closed. 9 hours of driving. For that. I sat in the car for almost an hour. No one came out. Not Miles. Not even a text. Nothing. The box sat between us, like a witness. I kept thinking back to when he was 8, when he cried because I wouldn't let him draw on those maps. He called them treasure. I told him they were history. Maybe they were both. Now they were just mine again. Eventually I started the car and pulled away. There's a kind of silence that happens when someone closes a door on you without a sound. It's louder than shouting. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even speak. But the silence said everything. I drove until the highway stopped feeling cruel, until the gaslight came on, until I could hear myself breathing without choking on disappointment. That night, in the motel room, I opened the box. I laid the maps out across the bed like old letters, tracing the lines with my fingers again. I remembered every turn, every bend, every dotted path. What my son had forgotten, I still remembered. And just like that, something inside me began to shift. Have you ever felt it? That quiet moment when the sadness fades and something stronger begins to settle in, because I felt it that night. And what I did the next morning, well, that part changes everything. The next morning, I drove back to my home in Blue Bluff. The sky was pale and thin, and I barely noticed the road. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even angry. But something about the silence inside me had hardened overnight. Not like a wall, more like a floor. I had somewhere to stand now. The house was quiet when I walked in. I lived alone since Thomas passed, and the stillness used to bother me. Not anymore. That morning it felt like a relief. I unpacked the maps and placed them back in the cabinet drawer, right beneath the hand-carved compass I once used on my father's land runs. That drawer was always where legacy lived. But something inside me knew the maps wouldn't be staying there much longer. Around noon, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table. I kept thinking about Miles's face when I held him the day he got into college. The boy who used to lean on me like I was his gravity. That boy hadn't answered my call, not even a message. A whole day had passed. I picked up the envelope from the edge of the table. It had arrived 2 weeks earlier from a regional museum I used to work with. They had been inviting me for years to return and help catalogue some historical trade maps. I had always declined, but this time, the envelope had a note from Sylvia Lannister, the director herself. She had heard I was keeping some rare family artifacts. She wondered if I might consider curating them for public view. I never responded. It had felt like too much at the time. Too final. But I opened the letter again, and I reread every word, and then I read it again. Something had shifted in me that morning. Miles's silence didn't just hurt. It clarified. I called Sylvia. She picked up on the second ring. She sounded surprised to hear my voice. Warm, though. Always was. We hadn't spoken in almost a year. I told her I was thinking about the offer, that I had 3 maps from the early 1900s. First-hand annotations, trade lines, route notes in my grandfather's hand, and that I was ready to let them live outside my house. She didn't rush me. She just said they had room for them, and if I ever wanted to come in person, they would be honored. After we hung up, I sat in the living room and stared at the fireplace for a long time. There were no flames, just cold stone, the kind that didn't warm a room, only watched it. It wasn't just about the maps. It was about the way my life had shrunk around my son's needs without me noticing. The dinners I cooked when he didn't show. The birthdays I sat through with Renee's family taking the spotlight. The time I loaned them $12,000 when they were starting that real estate firm and never once brought it up again. Because I believed in him, because that's what you do for people you love. That love had turned quiet, not because I stopped feeling it, but because he stopped receiving it. A week later, I visited the museum. The moment I walked into the curation wing, the air felt different, clean, measured. There were tables with gloves and magnifying glasses, walls lined with artifacts, volunteers working silently but purposefully. No one here was pretending to care. They were here because they already did. Sylvia greeted me with a long hug. She didn't ask questions, she only led me to a room labeled Private Collection Intake. Inside, I laid out the maps. I watched her fingers trace the edges with reverence. Not one word about value. Not one word about worth in dollars. Only worth in time. In story. In people. She asked if I would be willing to record a short history, something to accompany the display, maybe even talk to some of their interns. I said yes before I had time to second-guess it. When I drove home that evening, the town felt warmer. Same buildings, same trees. But I saw it all differently, like something had been peeled away from my eyes. Back at home, I cleaned out the cabinet drawer. I didn't leave it empty. I placed a small brass key inside. It had once opened my father's cedar chest. That chest was long gone, but the key remained. I didn't know why I kept it, until that moment. It was the last thing of his I had never shared. Now I was starting to understand why. Some things belong to blood, and some things belong to memory. But some, like maps, like stories, like silence broken at the right moment, they belong to legacy. And I was done handing that legacy to people who didn't want to carry it. I didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in years, I wanted to find out. I went to take out the trash the next morning and passed by the small corkboard near my fridge. For years, that board held old birthday cards, notes from neighbours, and photos of Miles from every stage of his life. First day of kindergarten, senior prom. That summer he spent working in Idaho and came home sunburnt and grinning. But what stopped me was the most recent photo I had pinned. It was from the year before, when I visited him and Renee for Thanksgiving. We had gone to the local arboretum, and a stranger had offered to take our picture. Renee had worn a deep green scarf, and Miles had placed his hand gently on her back. I stood next to them, smiling. That photo had been cut, right through the middle. Renee and Miles remained intact, but my half was cleanly sliced out. I stared at it for a long time, not in shock, in recognition. There's a way a person can be erased from their own life, and the first sign is never loud. It's subtle. When their seat at the table is moved without mention, when stories they told are retold without credit, when memories are edited, slowly, until they fit someone else's version of comfort. I took the photo down, folded it once, and placed it inside a recipe book. I had no appetite to throw it away. Not yet. Later that afternoon, I went to mail a small parcel to the museum. Sylvia had requested a copy of a journal my grandfather had kept during his freight travels. The post office clerk, Sandra, was a woman I had known for 20 years. She smiled and asked how Miles was doing. I smiled back, told her he was busy. Then I paused. I asked if she had time for coffee this week. She looked surprised but nodded. That was the first time I realized I didn't want to explain away what had happened. I just didn't want to carry it alone anymore. 3 days later, I met Sandra at the diner near the old town square. She wore a rust-coloured cardigan and carried a warmth that didn't rush. We sat near the window, where the light made everything feel gentler. I didn't tell her everything, just enough. She listened, didn't offer quick sympathy or empty words, just nodded as I spoke. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said it happened to her too. Her daughter had married into a wealthy family and slowly started pulling away. Calls became fewer, visits stopped altogether. Then one day, Sandra saw a Christmas photo online. The entire family standing in front of the tree. Except Sandra wasn't in it. She had hosted that year, cooked everything, cleaned, paid for most of it. And still she didn't belong. We sat in silence for a moment. Then she said that grief wasn't always about death. Sometimes it was about still being alive while someone chose to forget you. That stayed with me. When I got home that evening, I found an envelope wedged between the screen door and the frame. No return address. My name scribbled in familiar handwriting. Inside was a wedding invitation. Miles and Renee, set for 2 months from now, in Oregon. There was no note, just the invitation, crisp and white. And at the bottom, in tiny print, were the words, "Ceremony only, no reception." I stared at it for a long time. This was not forgetfulness. This was precision. I hadn't been told about the engagement dinner. Now I was being invited to a wedding where there was no room for a seat at the table. And still, Something in me didn't shatter. Instead, it clarified. I pulled out a box from the hallway closet. Inside were receipts, emails printed years ago, and a thin binder labeled Family Finances. I had started that binder back when Thomas got sick, to make sure Miles understood where things stood. Page after page, I reviewed what I had given him over the years. 2 loans. The first was $12,000 to start their first real estate flip. The second was $27,000 when they fell behind on property tax and nearly lost the house in Flagstaff. Both unpaid. Both undocumented. Because I trusted him. At the bottom of the stack was a copy of the title transfer for the lakeside cabin we owned. Thomas and I had signed it over to Miles 5 years ago, believing he would preserve it. But they had sold it 8 months later, used the money to invest in a renovation in Austin. I had found out through a friend who worked at the county office. I never said a word. Until now. I pulled out a fresh folder and began organizing the documents, not because I planned to fight, because I was done forgetting, done pretending, done letting other people decide the story of my life. By the time I finished, the sun had dipped low behind the pine trees. The kitchen was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't hollow. It was focused. And something in me had started to wake up. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. And the quiet rhythm of a woman finally putting her own name back into the story, even if that meant writing it from the margins first. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I didn't feel rested, but I couldn't lie still. There was a quiet tension under my skin, like something was waiting to be noticed. The house was still. Coffee brewed while the sun tried to rise behind grey clouds. I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at nothing in particular, until my eyes landed on the utility closet. That closet had been mine. Not just a place for old tools and light bulbs, but where I kept things no one else thought to ask about. I opened it slowly. My hand reached for the safe at the back, the same one Harold and I bought when we sold our first plot of land. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours, and we trusted it more than any bank. It took me a second to remember the combination, but my fingers didn't hesitate. Inside were manila folders, each thick with paper. Some were dusty, some were clean, but one in particular stood out. A small folder labeled Catskills. I opened it. Deed documents, handwritten notes. The cabin Harold and I had bought in upstate New York after my mother passed. It was a modest place, but it had meant something, a refuge, and it had always been mine, paid in full with my inheritance. Then I saw it. A new page stapled to the back, a transfer of title. The property had been moved into an LLC. Not just any name, it said Mile Wren Development Holdings. My hands froze. My eyes didn't. I read every word. Date, April of last year. Signatures, witnesses. A notary I'd never met. And nowhere was there my signature. They had taken it, without a word, without asking. I didn't cry. Not then. I just sat back in the chair and stared at the safe, at what else might be buried in the stacks of old paper. The shock ran deep, but beneath it, something else started to rise. I needed someone to confirm I wasn't imagining this, someone who understood legal documents better than I ever could. By noon, I was dressed and in the car. I didn't call Miles. I didn't text anyone. I drove past the town square and parked near a small law office with a faded green awning. Connolly and Hartman. I remembered June Connolly, the founder. Her daughter Meredith ran it now. The receptionist was young, polite, and visibly surprised to see me. Within minutes, Meredith stepped into the waiting room, shook my hand, and led me to her office. She didn't offer small talk, just waited for me to begin. I told her everything, from the moment I arrived at the house to the photo missing my face, the dinner I was never told about, and the deed to the cabin, transferred without my knowledge. She asked for the papers. I handed them over. Meredith read in silence. Her face remained calm, but her eyes darkened slightly. When she finished, she leaned back and said she'd seen this before. Not the exact situation, but similar patterns. Quiet power of attorney documents. Elderly parents signed off of assets without full understanding. Properties moved into holding companies that quietly cut the original owner out. I asked what could be done. She said she would start by researching the LLC, finding out who set it up, when, and whether my name had been used legally. She would also look into any recent legal filings in my name, power of attorney, changes to estate plans, anything suspicious. I left her office with a file folder and her card. She told me not to speak to Miles or Renee until we knew more. I nodded. Back home, I took every document from the safe and placed them into a locked briefcase. I put that briefcase in my trunk, just in case. Then I called my accountant and my insurance agent. I asked questions I should have asked years ago. That evening, I sat on the porch looking out at the lake. I didn't feel angry, not even sad. I felt clear, and that clarity felt heavier than anything else. For the first time in years, I saw my life for what it had become. Not what I had hoped, not what I thought I had built, just what it was. I had trusted too much. I had allowed silence to speak for me. I had let people I loved make decisions for me without questioning their motives, but not anymore. That night, I went into the attic and found a box I hadn't opened in years. Letters. A map. A key to the Catskills cabin, the one I never thought I'd need again. I traced the map with my finger. The roads looked thinner than I remembered, but I knew them. I could still find my way. The house no longer felt like home. But I wasn't lost. They thought they'd moved me out of the picture, but I was just getting started. The following days passed in an odd quiet, like the calm after a long storm that no one dared to speak of. Renee and Miles seemed to assume my silence meant resolution, maybe even surrender. But I wasn't quiet because I was passive. I was quiet because I was watching. The shift in their tone toward me had settled into something cold and transactional. I wasn't invited to sit with them during coffee. I wasn't included in calls with the wedding planner. Even the dog, Finn, had stopped curling at my feet. He had started sleeping outside their bedroom door. I didn't try to change it. I used the time to organize the rest of the paperwork from the safe, grouping everything into labeled folders. Old investment records, bonds, certificates of ownership for our previous land sales. And tucked away in one of the older envelopes, I found something I hadn't expected. A copy of Harold's last letter to me. It was handwritten in blue ink, dated 3 weeks before he died. I remembered now. He'd placed it on my bedside table and told me not to open it until I felt I needed to hear his voice again. He had written about the cabin, about the way I always lit the fireplace just before the sun dipped behind the hills, about the summer we painted the shutters green and danced barefoot on the porch after finishing the job. But near the end, his tone changed. He warned me that people, even those we love, can lose sight of what matters when money or power enters the picture. He told me not to doubt my instincts, and most importantly, he wrote this: "You are the steward of what we built. Protect it, even if that means walking away from those who don't deserve it." I folded the letter back up, slid it into my coat pocket, and sat in the stillness of the kitchen, listening to the clock tick, as if marking down the time I had left before everything changed. The next morning, Meredith called. She had looked deeper into Mile Wren Development Holdings. The LLC had been formed 5 months prior to my arrival, using a PO box in a nearby town. The signatory listed, Miles. The manager, Renee. My name was nowhere. Worse, Meredith found that the cabin property had been used as collateral on a short-term business loan. They had leveraged it to secure a down payment on a property I had never heard of, a commercial lease agreement tied to a venture in restaurant development, one that apparently was already in trouble. I didn't respond immediately. My hands felt numb, not from shock, but from confirmation. They had gambled something sacred, something meant to outlast both of us, in a scheme they never even bothered to share with me. Not only had they hidden the truth, they had used my trust as a platform to reach further than they ever should have. That evening, Renee stood at the stove making something that smelled like rosemary and lemon. Miles was reviewing emails at the dining table. I came in carrying a box. It was filled with framed photos, ones I had removed from the upstairs hallway. Photos of birthdays, vacations, cookouts. All of them had something in common. They had my face in them. I placed the box gently on the table. They both looked up. Neither said a word. I spoke clearly, my voice steady. I told them I'd be taking a trip upstate for a few days. I didn't elaborate. I didn't invite conversation. I simply said I needed time away. Renee asked if I'd be back for the wedding weekend. I said we would talk when I returned. I packed that night. 1 bag, 2 sets of warm clothes, the briefcase with every legal and financial document I had, and Harold's letter. I left early in the morning before the sun rose. I didn't leave a note. I didn't look back. The roads toward the Catskills felt narrower than I remembered, but my hands moved with a sense of memory and certainty I hadn't felt in years. The trees were beginning to turn. Crisp air slipped in through the window. When I arrived, the cabin stood exactly as it had decades ago, weathered but strong. The porch creaked under my steps. I unlocked the door and let the dust greet me like an old friend. Inside, I lit a fire, opened the windows, and breathed. For hours, I sat with nothing but silence and the warmth of the hearth. There was peace here, the kind you only recognize after you've been starved of it for too long. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. In the morning, I made tea and walked to the small mailbox at the edge of the gravel path. Inside, I left a letter addressed to Meredith. Inside it were copies of everything: the deed transfer, the LLC filing, Harold's letter, and a note from me. I asked her to move forward with a formal complaint. I asked her to prepare the necessary documents to dispute the legitimacy of the property transfer. I asked her to act not just as my lawyer, but as a witness to what I was about to reclaim. Because this wasn't just about land. It wasn't about money. It was about something much older and more fragile. It was about dignity, and I was done giving mine away. I returned to the city 3 days later, not because I missed them, but because I was ready. The cabin had done its work. It had reminded me who I was before I became someone's safety net, before I was someone to be tolerated, maneuvered around, and forgotten at the very table I once built. That fire crackling in the old stone hearth did more than warm me. It woke something up. Back in the house, Renee didn't even lift her eyes when I walked in. Miles mumbled a hello without looking up from his laptop. Their lives had carried on, and mine had simply exited. That suited me just fine. I went upstairs, opened my closet, and removed the travel bag. Inside was a single folder, thick with copies and notations and the weight of proof. I took a photo of every page and sent them to Meredith. Then I sat at the edge of my bed, closed my eyes, and breathed. That night, I didn't cook. I didn't ask if they needed anything. I didn't speak unless spoken to. The change confused them, I could tell. But they didn't press. They were still too confident. A week passed. Meredith called with an update. She had filed the petition to challenge the legitimacy of the property title transfer. Since the LLC was created with concealed intent, and since I was never made aware of its existence nor gave informed consent, there was ground to investigate for fraudulent conveyance. The house was mine again, at least in the eyes of the law, temporarily pending full investigation. But even that made something inside me settle. I didn't tell them right away. Instead, I observed. I paid attention to the way Renee took over the garden patio, now calling it her design project. I noticed how Miles started bringing in catalogues for luxury fixtures, none of which we had ever needed. There was no mention of the cabin, no whisper of the LLC. But there was a tension in their movements, like they were waiting for something to snap. It finally did. The morning the courier arrived with a large envelope addressed to me, Renee picked it up from the porch, glanced at the name, and brought it to the kitchen. I was having coffee. She placed it in front of me like it was nothing. I opened it slowly, aware of her eyes. Inside was a formal letter from the county recorder's office, acknowledging receipt of my claim and confirming that the property in dispute was now under legal review. Renee paled. She asked where it came from. I didn't answer. Miles came in. She handed him the letter. He scanned it quickly, then looked at me. His face didn't flush. It fell. He asked what I was doing. I said nothing. I simply got up, took the letter, and walked out to the sunroom. A few hours later, they asked to talk. We sat in the living room. Miles did most of the speaking. He said things had gotten complicated, that they only wanted to help the family's future. He mentioned the restaurant investment, the expansion plans, the timing. He claimed it was never about taking anything away from me. I nodded. Then I asked him why he never told me about the LLC, why he forged my signature on the deed transfer, why he used the cabin, the one place Harold and I built together, as collateral for a loan I had never seen. He didn't answer. Renee tried to step in. She said it was a misunderstanding, that I was always going to benefit, that it was all going to be in the family. I told her I had read Harold's letter again. I told her about his words on stewardship and protection, and I told her the part that mattered most. You do not protect something by giving it away to people who lie. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply told them I had retained full legal control of the property again, and that if they needed to find a new place to live, I could give them 60 days. Out of decency. Miles stared at the floor. Renee stared at me. Neither said a word. And in that silence, I felt something unshackle in my chest. Not relief, not triumph. Something else, a quiet certainty. They had thought they were building something grand, but they never realized they had broken the foundation first. And I had just reclaimed the ground beneath their feet. The 60 days passed like a train through fog. Quiet. Steady. I never had to ask if they were packing. Boxes began appearing near the stairs by the 3rd week. Renee's garden tools disappeared from the patio by the 5th. The clatter of Miles's espresso machine quieted by the 6th. They moved as if trying not to disturb something fragile, as if silence would make it less real. I didn't gloat. I didn't press. I didn't remind them. I went on with my days as I always had. Early coffee, old books, short walks around the neighborhood. The air in the house shifted, not tense anymore, hollow. Sometimes I caught Miles staring at me, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Renee avoided me altogether. We coexisted in rooms where nothing was spoken, and everything was known. On the 32nd day, I received a phone call from Meredith. She had just gotten out of a conference with a real estate lawyer her firm trusted. He had reviewed everything, and his first words to her were, "This wasn't just an error. This was a long plan." The LLC had been created over 14 months earlier. Miles had filed it under a different name. His best friend was listed as the registered agent. Renee's cousin, the one who always lingered too long at holidays, had signed as a witness. Every thread tied back to them. They had taken their time, moved slowly, waited for Harold to pass, waited for me to grieve, waited for the dust to settle. I wasn't just collateral. I was the last piece to be moved off the board. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Meredith on speaker. She read through the affidavit draft. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the edge of anger underneath. She said we could file to reclaim full ownership of the LLC assets, to dissolve the fraudulent transfer. She said we had a case, not just for property recovery, but for punitive damages. I thanked her, and then I hung up the phone and stared into the dark window over the sink. My reflection stared back, older, yes, but no longer afraid. By day 42, Miles asked if he could speak with me privately. We sat in the sunroom, the same room where Harold used to nap with the Sunday paper folded across his chest. Miles cleared his throat, fidgeted with his watch. He said he hadn't meant for things to go so far. He said he thought he could manage it better than I could. He said the family needed someone to take charge. I listened. He talked about investments, the business climate, the property taxes. I listened. Then he said something that stopped me cold. He said, "You don't even use it, Mum. The cabin. You sit in this house and you mourn." I stared at him for a long time. Then I told him about the weekend I spent up there alone, about the old log Harold carved our initials into, about the way the trees still creaked, the same way they did 30 years ago, about the letter I found, and the way I felt when I realized my name still mattered somewhere. He said nothing. I stood up, walked to the mantel, and picked up a framed photo. It was from Thanksgiving 12 years ago, the last one with Harold. Miles had his arm around me. Renee was smiling. It looked warm, real, but the woman in the photo had no idea what silence could hide. I handed the photo to him, and I said, "This is what I thought we were protecting." I walked out of the room and didn't look back. By day 54, they had packed the last of their things. Renee didn't say goodbye. She left a note on the kitchen counter, thanking me for letting them stay as long as they had. She said she hoped one day I would forgive her. The handwriting was careful, almost childlike. Miles was the last to close the door. He paused at the threshold, looked around the house one last time. Then he turned to me and said, "I didn't know what I was becoming." I nodded. Then I closed the door. And for the first time in months, I locked it. That evening, I walked out to the backyard, sat on the old wooden swing Harold built, and listened to the wind move through the trees. The silence felt different now. It wasn't hollow anymore. It was mine. 2 weeks after Miles and Renee left, the house began to sound different, not quieter, but fuller. The silence now had a rhythm, like the ticking of Harold's old clock that I'd restarted, or the distant shuffle of squirrels on the porch roof in the morning. I had space again, space that wasn't haunted by tension. I started reclaiming corners of the house I hadn't touched in years. The sewing room, not for stitching, but for sorting old letters and clippings I had meant to organize. The attic, where Harold's war journals still sat untouched. Even the basement pantry, still lined with jars of pickled green beans and tomato sauce, some of them likely too old to eat. but filled with memory. But peace doesn't always last long. It was late Thursday morning when the knock came. I wasn't expecting anyone. I figured it was a delivery. But when I opened the door, I didn't see a package. I saw Gwen, Harold's cousin. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the funeral. She stood on the porch, bundled in a long tan coat, her silver-grey hair clipped back. She looked smaller than I remembered, and older too, but her eyes hadn't changed. Sharp, unblinking. I stepped aside and let her in without a word. She didn't sit. She stood in the center of the living room, glancing slowly around. Then she said, "You know I always liked you more than your sister-in-law." I let out a quiet laugh. Then she got to the point. "I heard about the transfer and the LLC. You might not know this, but Harold came to me before he passed. He told me he was worried Miles would try something. Said he wanted to make sure you stayed protected." I sat down slowly. She reached into her coat and pulled out a slim envelope. "He gave me this. Said to hold it until I felt the time was right." I stared at it. The handwriting was Harold's. Neat. Blocked. She placed it in my hands, patted my shoulder, and turned to leave. "That's all I came to do. He'd want you to have it now." And just like that, she was gone. I didn't open the letter right away. I held it for a while, feeling the slight weight of it, as if it carried something heavier than paper. When I did finally slide my finger under the seal, I read it twice before I fully understood. Harold had created a second trust, not for Miles, not for any of the grandchildren, for me. He had transferred ownership of the cabin back to my name 2 months before he passed. Quietly, legally. It was mine. The LLC Miles created had never really owned it. The paperwork they filed, the transfers, they were built on a false premise. Harold's signature on their version of the deed was a copy, not the original. What Miles and Renee had sold was nothing more than a mirage. The land still belonged to me. My heart pounded as I reread the final line of the letter. "In case you ever need to remember who built this life with you, it was never them. It was us." I sat for a long time after that, staring out at the trees beyond the window, my breath steady, my chest tight, but not from pain this time, from a strange rising sense of affirmation. By the next morning, I had called Meredith. I told her everything Gwen said. I scanned the letter and emailed it over. She didn't even try to hide her reaction. This changes everything. Within days, the legal gears began to shift. The lawyer who had originally notarized Harold's documents confirmed their authenticity. The second trust was legally binding. Miles's sale of the property to the out-of-state investor was now a legal mess. The title company involved had already flagged inconsistencies and paused the final transfer of funds. I could almost hear the walls closing in on them. But I didn't feel joy. I felt sorrow. Not because I was uncertain, but because of how far we had drifted. How willing they were to erase me for something they couldn't even keep. One evening, I drove up to the cabin alone. The air was cooler now. Autumn had settled in. The leaves rustled under my boots as I walked the old path Harold used to clear every spring. The cabin looked untouched, empty, but not broken. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. It smelled like pine and cedar and thyme. I placed the letter on the kitchen table, and then I made tea. That night, I sat on the porch wrapped in Harold's old flannel blanket, watching the stars prick through the black sky. The silence wasn't hollow this time either. It was sacred, and as I listened to the wind stir through the trees, I realized something. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of the part of my life where I stopped apologizing for surviving, where I stopped shrinking to make space for others who never gave me any. The part where I took back what was mine. Not just land, but self. The call from Miles came on a Sunday evening, a week after the legal dust had started to settle. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting Harold's old photo albums into two piles, ones I wanted to keep out, and ones I was finally ready to put away. His name flashed across the screen, and I stared at it for a few seconds before answering. He didn't say hello. He said, "We'd like to invite you to dinner." No explanation, no apology, just that. He said Renee would cook, that they'd like to talk, clear the air. He said it like I hadn't just spent the last few weeks unraveling the mess they created. But I said yes. I wanted to look them in the eye. The night of the dinner, I wore the navy dress Harold always said, brought out the blue in my eyes. I didn't dress to impress them. I dressed to remind myself who I was. The house was clean, too clean. The scent of lavender and lemon was thick in the air, almost artificial. The table was already set, with Renee's fancy plates and cloth napkins she never used when it was just me. Renee greeted me at the door with a tight smile. Miles stood behind her, looking like he hadn't slept. Dinner started with small talk. Useless things, the weather, news about the neighbours. Renee mentioned a new Pilates class. I let them talk. The food was fine, bland, but I ate every bite, slowly, calmly. Then Miles finally said it. "We've had a rough couple weeks. The cabin deal fell through. The buyer pulled out. Lawyers are involved. It's been stressful." He looked at me then, not directly, more like just past me. "You probably already heard." I nodded once. Then he said, "We wanted to let you know we're ready to move forward, to put this behind us, as a family." It was Renee who added the last part. "You're still welcome here." Like she was extending some kind of grace. I placed my fork down gently and folded my hands. "That's very kind," I said, "but I brought something with me." I reached into my bag and slid the envelope across the table. Not Harold's letter. A copy of the legal filing Meredith had submitted that morning. The one that formally froze the assets of the LLC Miles created using my name. Renee didn't touch it. Miles stared at it for a moment before picking it up. He scanned the first page, then the second. His face went pale. "This isn't necessary," he muttered. I didn't respond. Renee said, "You're being dramatic." That made me smile. Then I said, "I spent 35 years standing beside Harold, building what we had, supporting this family, and in a single afternoon, you both decided I was dispensable, that I didn't matter." I paused and took a sip of water. "You sold something that wasn't yours, lied to do it, and you left me out in the cold." I leaned back in my chair. "So no, this isn't about drama. This is about boundaries, consequences." Miles opened his mouth but didn't speak. Then I said what I came to say. "You will no longer have access to any of my accounts. I have rewritten every document, the power of attorney, the trusts, the emergency contacts. Your names are no longer there." I watched the colour drain from Renee's face. The air in the room shifted. The polite performance dropped. I added, "I don't do this out of spite. I do it out of necessity. For peace." I stood up and smoothed my dress. Dinner was lovely. "Thank you." Neither of them moved. I walked myself to the door. No one followed. In the car, I sat for a moment before turning the key. My hands were steady. My chest felt light. When I got home, I made tea. I lit a candle on the porch, and I opened Harold's letter one more time, just to feel his words again. I slept soundly that night, and for the first time in months, I dreamed of nothing at all. Only silence. Full, sacred silence. A week passed since the dinner. Nothing followed, no calls, no apologies, not even a card. But I didn't need one. Instead, I focused on the next thing. Something Harold and I had talked about in whispers near the end, when his breathing had slowed, and he started speaking in short, honest bursts. "We should build something," he had said once. "Something that lasts longer than any of this, longer than land, longer than names." At the time, I had thought he meant the cabin, but maybe he had meant something more. I started spending my mornings at the public library in town, not in the fiction section where I used to browse. This time, I was downstairs, in the little basement room where community initiatives were pinned to corkboards and city meeting notices curled under thumbtacks. I pulled out a folder I had brought with me. Inside were notes Meredith helped me draft. Legal frameworks, non-profit templates. I stared at them long enough that I stopped seeing the text and started seeing faces. Women. Older women. Like me. Women who had worked, who had given, who had been erased or silenced by the very families they built. I thought of Carol, the nurse who used to live down the street before her kids sold her car and moved her into an apartment complex an hour away from everyone she knew. I thought of Susan, whose daughter had tricked her into signing over her retirement annuity, leaving her with a single bedroom in her own house. I remembered every quiet conversation I had shared with them on front porches and in grocery aisles, all the times they had said nothing while meaning everything. So I did it. I filed the paperwork. The Lena Foundation, named after my grandmother, a woman who raised 5 children on her own after the war, and never once complained, even when she had every right to. The mission was clear: to educate and empower women over 60 who faced financial and emotional manipulation from their families, to provide legal clinics, skills workshops, and housing assistance, to create something that let them reclaim the life they thought had already passed them by. Meredith introduced me to a retired accountant named June, who offered to help pro bono. June had once been pushed out of her own practice by her sons. She worked with precision and zero tolerance for nonsense. Then came Ellie, a widowed real estate broker, who had lost her home when her stepson forged her name on a refinance application. She helped me scout a small office space right next to the bus station, easy for anyone to reach. Word spread quickly. At first it was just nods from older women at the diner. Then came folded notes, slipped into my coat pocket at church. Handwritten letters with no return address. Short. Raw. Brave. I read them all. I remembered them all. One letter came from a woman named Judith. She wrote, "I gave everything to them, and now they say I imagined it all. I don't need much. I just want to feel like I exist." I carried her words with me for days. We hosted the first workshop on a rainy Saturday. I bought muffins from the market and made coffee in a borrowed percolator. 6 women came. One cried before we even began. Another brought a stack of unopened bills she had been too afraid to read. I didn't stand at a podium. I sat with them, at eye level. I shared my story. Not the whole thing, just enough. Enough for them to see I wasn't above them. I was beside them. At the end of the session, one woman stayed behind. She wore a burgundy coat and held a small photograph in her lap. It was her younger self, with her husband, laughing in the snow. She said, "I haven't laughed like that in years." Then she looked up. But today came close. That night, I walked home in the cold. My shoes were soaked, my fingers numb, but I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Steady, centered, the kind of peace that doesn't come from being praised or accepted. The kind that grows from doing what is right, even when no one claps. The next day, Meredith called. She said the court had ruled in our favor. Miles's LLC was dissolved. The assets returned. The cabin was now fully protected. I thanked her. Then I told her something I hadn't said out loud yet. Winning the case wasn't the point anymore. The point was this: these women, this room, this ripple. And that was something no document could ever undo. I placed Judith's letter in a small box I kept under my bed, along with the photo of Harold and me by the lake, and the letter he left. They didn't belong on shelves anymore. They belonged here, close, alive. And in the morning, I would show up again, just like them, just like me. The local paper ran a small feature on the Lena Foundation the following week. A columnist named Bryn had attended one of our Saturday sessions and asked if she could sit quietly in the back. She didn't take many notes, just watched. I hadn't expected anything. But then came the article. A quiet, powerful piece about women rediscovering their voice. She didn't mention names, just the essence. And somehow, that was louder than anything printed in bold. 2 days later, I got a call. It was from a woman named Michelle Everett. She introduced herself as a program director with the local PBS affiliate. She said she had read the article. Then she asked if I might be willing to speak at their annual Women's Legacy Night. I paused. I had spent months rebuilding from the ground up, pouring my time and heart into something real. But it had all happened in quiet places, folded notes, library rooms, shared coffee. This was different. A stage, a spotlight. Still, I said yes. They held it at the old theatre downtown. When I arrived, I almost turned around, not because I was scared, but because I wasn't sure my story belonged on a stage. But Meredith was already there, waiting near the entrance in a deep green dress. She looked proud in a way that made my feet move forward. They gave me 8 minutes. I didn't read from notes. I spoke slowly, letting each word come up from my ribs. I talked about the land Harold and I had kept for 40 years. I talked about the silence I had lived in after he passed. I talked about the mistake I made in believing love guaranteed loyalty. And I talked about the day I sat across from my own son and realized he no longer saw me as a mother, but as a stepping stone. But more than anything, I talked about what happened after. Not the revenge, not the courtroom, the quiet rebuilding, the women, the ripple. When I stepped off the stage, the applause didn't come in a wave. It came in soft, steady claps, the kind you feel more than hear. I didn't look for anyone in the crowd. I just walked back to my seat and sat down, like nothing had happened. But something had. The following Monday, a letter arrived at the foundation. It was from Miles, short, cold. He said he had seen the broadcast, that he hoped I would refrain from using family matters in public speeches, that he was considering legal options if it continued. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That same afternoon, Judith arrived early to the center. She brought a small basket of lavender muffins and placed them on the table without a word. As we waited for others, she leaned toward me. She said she had seen me on TV. Her voice was low, a bit shaky. Then she said, "For the first time in years, I believed I still mattered." I didn't speak. I just reached for her hand and held it there, warm and still. That night, as I walked home, I passed the old law office where Meredith used to work before she started her own practice. The lights were off, but the window reflected something I hadn't seen in a long time. Me. Not the woman bent by grief, not the mother shamed in her own home, but the one standing now, steady, whole. The truth was, I had already won, not in the court, not in the papers, but in every letter, every workshop, Every woman who walked through our door, unsure and left a little taller. The final transaction had already happened. They took the land. I gave away the legacy. And what I got in return was a life. Unapologetic, unedited, unclaimed. And that, no threat, no letter, no silence, could ever take back. The morning light through my window didn't feel any different. But I did. It wasn't a grand realization, more like a stillness that settled into my bones. For the first time in years, I didn't wake with a list of things to fix, people to protect, or silence to swallow. I simply got up and made tea. Outside, the leaves had started to shift color. The reds and golds came early this year. I sat on the porch, wrapped in Harold's old cardigan, and watched the breeze carry pieces of the past into new directions. There had been no reply to Miles's letter, and I knew there wouldn't be. I had nothing to defend anymore. What I did have was a waiting room full of women by 10 o'clock, each with their own battles and betrayals, some louder than mine, some buried deeper. They came with notebooks and paper cups, and the kind of weariness that only other women could recognize. They didn't come to hear my story. They came to remember their own. And that, I realized, was the point. The last time I saw Miles, it wasn't at a trial or on a news clip. It was a grocery store parking lot, 3 weeks after the PBS event. He looked thinner, not unhealthy, just small. He glanced at me. I nodded. He looked away, and that was it. No words, no apologies, just space. Sometimes silence is a sentence. Later that week, I visited Harold's grave. I hadn't been back in months, not out of anger, but because I no longer needed to speak to the stone to feel him. I brought a sunflower from the foundation garden and tucked it into the grass. Then I stood there, eyes closed, and let everything go. The ranch, the courtroom, the documents, the years I spent begging to be seen inside my own family. Letting go doesn't always feel like freedom. Sometimes it feels like grief walking itself home. But standing there, I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was just me. A woman with lines around her eyes, stories under her skin, and a quiet victory in her chest. That night, I locked up the center and walked the long way home. The air was cool, the streets empty. I didn't need company. I didn't need recognition. I had already received what I came for. Peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, the kind that comes from not needing to win anymore. They thought they could erase me from a will, from a home, from memory, but I had rewritten myself into something they could never touch. Legacy isn't what you leave in a vault. It's what you leave in people. And mine was just getting started. If you've ever felt like your voice was pushed aside, like your worth was tied to someone else's approval, I want you to sit with this story a moment longer. What would it look like to reclaim your peace without asking permission? If this touched something in you, you're not alone. Share your thoughts below. Someone else might need to read your words tonight. Let's keep the conversation going. For every woman rebuilding quietly, just like Lena.